Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. I'm here with Matt and Simone. This week's story is A Shameful Affair by Kate Chopin. Matt, you picked the story. Can you introduce us, please?
I did, and I picked this story the week after I said that romance wasn't really my thing, if you're paying attention, which may confuse you. No, I like this story. It was recommended to me. Well, the author of the story was recommended to me. I read a few, and I was like, okay, yeah, these are fun. Even though they're like really old, they're still fun, and I enjoyed them a lot. And I picked this one in particular because I thought the ending was interesting, and I would like to discuss it.
Has it changed your mind about romance stories? Do you like them more now? No, you still don't really like them.
No, I never said I didn't like them. I said it wasn't my go-to genre, which I think is still true. But
okay.
No, I enjoyed it.
You enjoyed it. Okay, excellent. All right. Here is A Shameful Affair by Kate Chopin.
Mildred Orme, seated in the snuggest corner of the big front porch of the Cromer farmhouse, was as content as a girl need hope to be. This was no such farm as one reads about in humorous fiction. Here were swelling acres where the undulating wheat gleamed in the sun like a golden sea. For silver there was the Merrimy, or better, it was pure crystal, for here and there one might look clean through it, down to where the pebbles lay like green and yellow gems. Along the river's edge trees were growing to the very water, and in it, sweeping it when they were willows. The house itself was big and broad, as country houses should be. The master was big and broad too, the mistress was small and thin, and it was always she who went out at noon to pull the great clanging bell that called the farmhands in to dinner. From her agreeable corner where she lounged with her Browning or her Ibsen, Mildred watched the woman do this every day. Yet when the clumsy farmhands all came tramping up the stairs and crossed the porch and going to their meal that was served within, she never looked at them. Why should she? Farmhands are not so very nice to look at, and she was nothing of an anthropologist. But once, when the half-dozen men came along, a paper which she had laid carelessly upon the railing was blown across their path. One of them picked it up, and when he had mounted the steps restored it to her. He was young and brown, of course, as the sun had made him. He had nice blue eyes. His fair hair was dishevelled, his shoulders were broad and square, and his limbs strong and clean. A not unpicturesque figure in the rough attire that bared his throat to view and gave perfect freedom to his every motion. Mildred did not make these several observations in the half-second that she looked at him in courteous acknowledgment. It took her as many days to note them all, for she signalled him out each time that he passed her, meaning to give him a condescending little smile, as she knew how. But he never looked at her. To be sure, clever young women of 20, who are handsome besides, who have refused their half-dozen offers and are settling down to the conviction that life is a tedious affair, are not going to care a straw whether farmhands look at them or not. And Mildred did not care, and the thing would not have occupied her a moment if Satan had not intervened in offering the employment which natural conditions had failed to supply. It was summer-time, she was idle, she was piqued, and that was the beginning of this shameful affair. Who are these men, Mrs. Cromer, that work for you? Where do you pick them up? Oh, we picks them up everywhere. Some is neighbours, some is tramps, and so— And that broad-shouldered young fellow, is he a neighbour, the one who handed me my paper the other day? You remember? God, no, you might just as say he was a tramp, aber he works like a steam engine. Well, he's an extremely disagreeable-looking man. I should think you'd be afraid to have him about, not knowing him. What you want to be afraid for? Laughed the little woman. And when he was deaf and dumb. I didn't taught you was such a baby. But, Mrs. Cromer, I don't want you to think I'm a baby, as you say, a coward as you mean. Ask the man if he will drive me to church tomorrow. You see, I'm not so very much afraid of him, she added with a smile. The answer, which this unmanly farmhand returned to Mildred's request, was simply a refusal. He could not drive her to church, because he was going fishing. Aber, offered good Mrs. Cromer, Hans Platzfeld will drive you to church, oder wherever you wants. He was a good boy that you can trust, that Hans. Oh, thank him very much, but I find I have so many letters to write tomorrow, and it promises to be hot too. I shan't to go to church after all. She could have cried for vexation. Snubbed by a farmhand, a tramp perhaps. She, Mildred Orme, who ought really to have been with the rest of the family at Narragansett, who had come to seek in this retired spot the repose that would enable her to follow exalted lines of thought. She marvelled at the problematic nature of farmhands. After sending her the uncivil message already recorded, and as he passed beneath the porch where she sat, he did look at her finely, in a way to make her positively gasp at the sudden effrontery of the man. But the inexplicable look stayed with her. She could not banish it. It was not so very hot after all the next day, when Mildred walked down the long narrow footpath that led through the bending wheat in midsummer-time. Knows that sound. In the woods it was sweet and solemn and cool, and there beside the river was the wretch who had annoyed her, first with his indifference, then with the sudden boldness of his glance. "Are you fishing?" she asked politely, and with kindly dignity, which she supposed would define her position toward him. The inquiry lacked not pertinence, seeing that he sat motionless, with a pole in his hand, and his eyes fixed on a cork that bobbed aimlessly on the water. "Yes, madam," was his brief reply. "It won't disturb you if I stand here a moment to see what success you will have?" "No, madam." She stood very still, holding tight to the book she had brought with her. Her straw hat had slipped disreputably to one side, over the wavy bronze-brown bang that covered half her forehead. Her cheeks were ripe with colour that the sun had coaxed there. So were her lips. All the other farmhands had gone forth in Sunday attire. Perhaps this one had none better than these working clothes that he wore. A feminine commiseration swept her at the thought. He spoke never a word. She wondered how many hours he could sit there, so patiently waiting for fish to come to his hook. For her part, the situation began to pall, and she wanted to change it at last. "Let me try a moment, please. I have an idea." "Yes, madam." "The man is surely an idiot with his monosyllables," she commented inwardly, but she remembered that monosyllables belonged to a bore's equipment. She laid her book carefully down and took the pole gingerly that he came to place in her hands. Then it was his turn to stand back and look respectfully and silently on at the absorbing performance. "Oh!" cried the girl, suddenly seized with excitement upon seeing the line drag deep in the water. Wait, not yet." He sprang to her side, with his eyes eagerly fastened on the tense line. He grasped the pole to prevent her drawing it, as her intention seemed to be. That is, he meant to grasp the pole, but instead his brown hand came down upon Mildred's white one. He stared violently at finding himself so close to a bronze-brown tangle that almost swept his chin, to a hot cheek only a few inches away from his shoulder, to a pair of young dark eyes that gleamed for an instant unconscious things into his own. Then, wherever it happened, or however it happened, his arms were holding Mildred, and he kissed her lips. She did not know if it was 10 times, or only once. She looked around, her face milk white, to see him disappear with rapid strides through the path that had brought her there. Then she was alone. Only the birds had seen, and she could count on their discretion. She was not wildly indignant, as many would have been. Shame stunned her. But through it she gropingly wondered if she should tell the Crowmers that her chaste lips had been rifled of their innocence, publish her own confusion. No! Once in her room, she would give calm thought to the situation, and determine then how to act. The secret must remain her own, a hateful burden to bear alone until she could forget it. And because she feared not to forget it, Mildred wept that night. All day long a hideous truth had been thrusting itself upon her that made her ask herself if she could be mad. She feared it. Else why was that kiss the most delicious thing she had known in her 20 years of life? The sting of it had never left her lips since it was pressed into them. The sweet trouble of it banished sleep from her pillow. But Mildred would not bend the outward conditions of her life to serve any shameful whim that chanced to visit her soul like an ugly dream. She would avoid nothing. She would go and come like always. In the morning she found in her chair upon the porch the book she had left by the river. A fresh indignity! But she came and went as she intended to, and sat as usual upon the porch in her familiar surroundings. When the offender passed by her she knew it, though her eyes were never lifted. Are there only sight and sound to tell such things? She discerned it by a wave that swept her with confusion, and she knew not what besides. She watched him furtively one day when he talked with Farmer Crowmer out in the open. When he walked away, she remained like one who has drunk much wine. Then, unhesitatingly, she turned and began her preparations to leave the Crowmer farmhouse. When the afternoon was far spent, they brought letters to her. One of them read like this: "My Mildred, dearie, I am now at Narragansett, and so broke up not to find you. So you were down at that Crowmer farm on the Iron Mountain. Well, what do you think of that delicious crank, Fred Evelyn? For a man must be a crank who does such things. Only fancy! Last year he chose to drive an engine back and forth across the plains. This year he tills the soil with labourers. Next year it'll be something else as insane, because he likes to live more lives than one kind, and other quixotic reasons. We are great chums. He writes me he's grown as strong as an ox, but he hasn't mentioned that you are there. I know you don't get on with him, for he isn't a bit intellectual, detests Ibsen, and abuses Tolstoy. He doesn't read in books, says they are spectacles for the short-sighted to look at life through. Don't snub him, dear, or be too hard on him. He has a heart of gold, if he is the first crank in America." Mildred tried to think, to feel the intelligence which this letter brought to her would take somewhat of the sting from the shame that tortured her. But it did not. She knew that it could not. In the gathering twilight she walked again through the wheat that was heavy and fragrant with dew. The path was long and very narrow. When she was midway, she saw the offender coming toward her. What could she do? Turn and run, as a little child might? Spring into the wheat, as some frightened four-footed creature would? There was nothing but to pass him, with the dignity which the occasion clearly demanded. But he did not let her pass. He stood squarely in the pathway before her, hat in hand, a perturbed look upon his face. "Miss Orme," he said, "I have wanted to say to you, every hour of the past week, that I am the most consummate hound that walks the earth." She made no protest. Her whole bearing seemed to indicate that her opinion coincided with his own. "If you have a father or brother, or anyone in short, to whom you may say such things—" "I think you aggravate the offence, sir, by speaking of it. I shall ask you never to mention it again. I want to forget that it ever happened. Will you kindly let me by?" "Oh," he ventured eagerly, "you want to forget it? Then maybe, since you are willing to forget, you will be generous enough to forgive the offender some day." "Some day," she repeated, almost inaudibly, looking seemingly through him but not at him. "Some day, perhaps, when I shall have forgiven myself." He stood motionless, watching her slim, straight figure lessening by degrees as she walked slowly away from him. He was wondering what she meant. Then, a sudden quick wave when he guessed what it might be.
Simone, what were your first impressions of this story?
He deserved better. I know, the protagonist wasn't very likeable, was she? At least I didn't particularly like her. She's just a bit up herself. I was just like, I'm sorry, you do not deserve love. You're a bad heroine. But anyway, other than that, I enjoyed it. I loved watching it all go wrong for her because of her prejudice.
I see. I
I
thought
mean,
she was funny. What do you think, Matt?
I see what you mean, but I respect that she's at least self-aware, or at least seems to be by the end of the story, and repents her ways. I think that redeems her somewhat.
I thought she was supposed to be like over the top dramatic with everything. And Simone, did you have anything to add?
I did, but I think I'll come back to it when we get to our feelings about the ends of the story.
Okay,
It kind of
sounds
links to
good.
that, because you said she repented. I would argue that she doesn't. Not really.
All right, sounds like we're going to get into this later.
The story is all about the ending.
Okay, well, I'll try and get through the other bits quickly then. So we can get to the best bit, of course. All right, so I liked this story a lot. I thought it was kind of a parody of those rom-coms where the idea is that the protagonists discover all the ideas they had about the other person were wrong, because actually the first ideas of the characters, I think, are proved right about each other instead of being proved wrong. That was just
You
my
think?
take on it. Well, I thought
So
so.
what do you think that she initially thought about him, and do you think that was still true at the end?
I mean, I thought she was a bit dismissive of him and was just a bit like, oh, he's a lowly farmhand. And even though she discovers that maybe he's not a lowly farmhand because of the letter, she still treats him like that, doesn't she? So she doesn't really go, oh, well, you're not. She still sees him the same way, even though she's been told otherwise. That's what I thought from reading the story.
Interesting. I agree with your beginning part about it setting up a lot of the traditional romantic tropes of them having a misunderstanding for each other. It had enemies to lovers potential.
Yeah.
True. What was the deal with this letter?
I got the impression that he was like a rich guy pretending to be poor, for the frills, essentially.
Yeah, I got the impression that he was from the upper classes as the protagonist was, but he was, for whatever reason, just taking on whatever jobs he could find instead of doing upper class things like talking about money. I don't really know what but not working on a farm with the other laborers essentially. So I thought the reveal was like supposed to be, oh wait, no, he is a virtuous man after all, therefore it was fine that I kissed him. But instead it just seems to be like, well, this was a terrible mistake. Let's never talk about it ever again. And that's the end.
Why do you think her opinion of him changed by the end?
No, because her feelings don't change. She's still ashamed.
Originally, she thought he was just a lowly farmhand, and now she finds out he is not. So she must see him differently in some sense. I know she says her feelings haven't changed, but
She's also a character who lies throughout.
that's true.
Like, I don't care that he didn't look at me at all. Yeah, sure you didn't.
Yeah. Unless the story is actually that the appeal has worn off now. She knows who he is. Maybe I can't read.
That's an interesting interpretation, actually, and it does kind of fit.
Oh,
I think it could be read that way. I didn't read it that way, but I think it could be.
Yeah, for
because
sure.
maybe if she wants like the thrill and excitement of doing something naughty, now she doesn't have any thrill. She just has the shame that she's kissed a random guy, or a random guy has kissed her.
I think you're right, and that's one of the good things about the story is that you can read it in several different ways.
Yeah. Okay, should we talk about the setting a little bit? Like, what did you think it adds to the story? I thought it was quite interesting to set it on what I think seems to be an out of the way farm where she's the only person there of her class.
Well, it's your summer romance, isn't it? She's kind of away from home. It's bright and sunny. The farm maybe represents a return to basics, like farming is often seen as like the most kind of rudimentary kind of profession, where it's like the origins of humanity or whatever you want to call it. Which I think is maybe an analog to the romance aspect, which is often seen as almost animalistic.
A good interpretation, I think.
I thought the bit where he was fishing was interesting, just because I was like, is this a metaphor?
Oh, right, I see.
That did not occur to me.
Same.
I just thought he was, fishing and she just wanted attention.
Well, I mean, that, yeah, she did. He was and she did. But I wondered if it was like, about catching a romantic partner, like they say, plenty of fish in the sea and that kind of thing. I wondered if it was an allusion to that idea. When she goes to help him, that's when they kiss because, he's caught her.
That makes perfect.
He's a very patient fisherman as well. It's even mentioned that he's patient. So
It also adds to the idea that he's someone who can kind of handle himself and like is self-sufficient. Like, idea of like you want a guy who can put food on your table.
I really liked his attitude in that scene. He was just like, yes, madam, no, madam. Just going about his life because he knows he doesn't have to do anything else.
Yeah, I thought it was quite a good setting for a romance. Had a lot of places they could meet and have privacy.
yeah, I love the description at the beginning.
Like the way that the landscape was just kind of exaggerated in these very poetic, flowery language. I don't know. It makes you think about maybe the heightened sense of emotion you might get in a summer romance kind of situation.
It definitely set the scene for something romantic happening.
The pebbles lay like green and yellow gems. I love that line. It's just a pebble, but it's so sparkly. The sun is shining down and we're ready for a romance.
And we're introduced to all of the key areas within like the first paragraph with like the fields and the river's edge. Like everywhere scenes happen essentially.
Yeah, it does introduce its setting quickly and then
It's a good example of how setting can be picked more or less well, and even if it's not got a huge like overt impact, like they're not battling nature or anything, it can still have an impact on what your characters do and where they can meet and things like that.
I think it makes the atmosphere really nice.
It's what you want from your setting. You just want to kind of get the right kind of tone a lot of the time.
Yeah. Okay, so my next question then. Some of the dialogue for Mrs. Crowmer is written phonetically. Did either of you have any trouble reading it?
Yes, it was horrible.
Okay.
I understood it, it just annoyed me. Like, I didn't have trouble reading it, I just didn't personally like it. And I wondered why they did that with her and none of the other characters.
I guess it was to exaggerate the way that she spoke, but I don't know. If you make me read something twice to understand it, I'm a bit like, please stop.
I guess if you listen to the story on audio, you might not realize, but her dialogue is just apostrophe riddled and got like V's instead of W's and all this kind of stuff, which makes it a little bit hard to pick out what she's saying. And I think the standard advice on this is if you're going to do like phonetic language like that in your dialogue, then you should do it sparingly and be kind of very careful with it, because it's nice in a small amount to just like paint your character a little and show a bit more of who they are and how they speak. But if you overdo it and it just becomes a chore to read.
On the other hand, you do get books like Train Spotting by Irvin Welsh, which wouldn't work if they didn't have the very heavy dialect that they are based on. Like sometimes it can very much bring you into a character and their world. I still personally prefer not to read it, but there is an argument to be made for it.
I think
I like it to be sparse.
Yeah. What about The Knife of Never Letting Go?
I knew you were going to say that.
You knew I was going to say that. Do you think that book proves that you can get away with it if you know what you're doing?
Which part are you referring to in that book?
any of it really, because it's all written in like the way Todd speaks, which is sort of southern.
It is, and it also, because he's illiterate, it has misspellings in it on purpose,
I
which
forgot
I
about
think
that.
is quite controversial.
Mm.
I didn't hate it, it was fine. But I think the key part of that was it was usually clear what he was saying, at least. You didn't have to think about it for a couple of seconds, because even if you have to stop, even if it's just for a second or two, it's annoying.
And it should still be clear by context. But then I think a lot of the times when novels or stories do use dialect, but as a white person, I'm very aware that my style of talking is the one that is given currency in novels and in films, where dialect is often representing different ways of speaking. And there is an importance to showing that and not just kind of suggesting everyone speaks the same, and that could be lost in, I guess, future books if there is no one recording that.
So my next question then was, how to write conflict in romantic stories? Have you got any tips or tricks or ideas about the best way to do this?
I think in romance, more than any other genre, it's important to link the conflict to the character. So even if you have an external conflict, the important part is how your character reacts to it, because that's how romance works. Like, it should be the way two characters fit together or don't fit together. Whereas other genres, you can get away with more external stuff.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
kind of ties into what I was going to say, which was in romance, the conflict, there tends to be much more about characters' identities and characters' specific feelings on things or relationships in particular, I suppose. But yeah, identities is a big one, and I think this story uses that quite a lot. So I thought it was a relevant one to bring up.
I think it's interesting to note that romance is very much an internal kind of thing. It's about the character's thoughts and feelings. Therefore, you often have an external conflict to supplement it. Example would be David Nichols' Start for 10, where ostensibly it's about the character's relationships, but it's also that he just wants to be really good at University Challenge. So you have the internal conflict and the external, and it's making those two things interweave and making them relate to each other that is important. And I think if you just had a story that was focused on internal conflict or just focused on external, it wouldn't really work. I mean, you get the opposite in a lot of genre fiction. Fantasy, the main plot is usually like saving the world or winning a war or something, but then you have an supplementary internal conflict, which is more about relationships or the character's identity.
What is the best way to try and link the two things together? Like, how would you go about doing it?
I think it depends a little on what kind of, like, for example, what genre is the primary genre? Essentially, if you can take the romance out of the story, you're writing a romantic subplot, not a romantic novel in a fantasy setting, for example, or a criminal setting, or whatever thriller setting. If you can't take it out, then you are writing predominantly a romance with other elements.
Does that then guide you on how to fit the rest of the pieces of the story together?
I think so, because if the relationship is the driving core and point of your story, then the decisions and the pull and push of that relationship is going to be what drives your plot points. Take, for example, Beauty and the Beast is a fantasy romance in the sense that it's primarily a romance story, but a lot of the vehicle that it uses to tell the story is fantasy. For example, the curse is what the romance revolves around. But the actual core points, focusing on the Disney version because it's one people might know about, a lot of the key parts aren't necessarily specifically to do with the fantasy setting, it's to do with how characters are reacting to it. So, for example, Belle sees the rose, the beast gets angry, it's learning something about the fantasy world building around the story. But it's the fact that the beast gets angry and she gets frightened that causes a change in their relationship and thus drives the plot, because she runs, he saves her, they end up bonding.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
yeah, it's internal.
Yeah.
For another example, we could look at Start for 10 again, where his romantic interests are on his University Challenge team. So if he messes up his relationship with them, he's going to have some trouble working as a team. And if he messes up at the quiz, they're going to probably be mad at him because they take it very seriously. So, they're inextricably linked that way.
Yes.
Okay, so you need some kind of device to kind of link your characters' internal and external.
There needs to be a
arcs.
reason for them to interact with each other, I guess.
Yeah.
And to kind of keep pulling them back together, even if they're at the point when they'd be like, actually, I want nothing to do with you right now. Like, say they're on the same team project, or like Start of 10, or competing, for example, and are therefore forced to the same events.
This helps a lot with your resolution as well, because if you follow the Hollywood formula, you would want your different conflicts and your story threads to all resolve as close together as possible so you get the biggest emotional payoff. So if you're trying to resolve your internal conflict and your external conflict in the same space, but they're very different, then you're going to have some problems.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think one thing I'd still want to point out on conflict in romantic stories, which I think is relevant to this particular story, in that this one's based around misunderstandings. I think it's important for the character to get the letter, regardless of her reaction to it, because otherwise the reason that they're not together is based on a misunderstanding, which I think can be very frustrating. Like, misunderstandings can be used for humour, but ultimately I think if your romantic conflict can be solved by a conversation, and you're just not having your characters talk for whatever reason that's not driven by some deeper internal conflict, like don't want to bring something up because they're scared of rejection, is kind of tackling a different issue than just, they refuse to talk about it because they hate this person forever, and clearly this person hates them, and they will just never ever mention it, which is frustrating.
Okay, I think I sense some frustration here that we can now talk about, because we're on to the question about how did you feel about the end of the story?
The ending is ambiguous. It is very ambiguous. Do we agree?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay. No, I like this ending because it is very open, and I think in longer form fiction, novels, even films maybe, there is a need to have a closed ending. We need something that says, okay, this is done, it's neatly finished, tied up with a bow, move on. I think short stories are a bit different, and increasingly you need something that feels kind of almost unfinished, because you don't want your reader to move on. You want them, you haven't even had their attention for very long. It's only a short story. You kind of want them to linger on it and think, what does this mean? And to me, that's what this ending does.
Or maybe what happens next, which is what I was thinking about.
Yes.
Yeah, I found this ending a little bit strange for that reason, I think. I expect my romance stories to either end with a couple together or to be tragedies and they can never be together for whatever reason. And this story didn't really do either.
I think that's why I like it. It's done something a little bit different.
I mean, it skews where the point of the story is, because if it was, the point was a romance, then I think it would end up with the more traditional them getting together or them not getting together, like more decisively. But one could argue that the point of the story is about the preconceptions about class, in which case it is answering that point, which means it is technically finishing that part of the story.
I think it concludes with the conclusion of her character arc in realizing her attitudes were flawed originally.
Because at the end she says that she needs to forgive herself.
Yes.
What do you think she needs to forgive herself for?
I think she means that she needs to forgive herself for being ashamed of wanting to associate with him, as complicated as that kind of sounds.
No, yeah, I can see that.
So, needs to forgive herself for wanting him when she didn't realize he was of her class.
No, I think I think she's accepted that that is true, and she's now ashamed of the fact that she was ashamed of it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
That's how it felt to me.
One alternative reading would be, given that it's a shameful affair in the sense that she is a young lady of the upper class, which means she probably shouldn't be kissing men unescorted in order to, assure a good marriage later. She could be ashamed because of that as well, arguably.
That's kind of what I thought. So that's why I thought earlier when I was saying, oh, but her attitude didn't change. That's kind of what I thought that line meant. But now I'm like, maybe I was wrong.
I think I skew more towards her regretting her assumptions about him. But also the fact that she only regrets it because she now realizes he's some handsome rich guy, as opposed to the story challenging that actually he would have been worthy of her respect even if he wasn't, makes me not necessarily like her.
Yeah.
It almost kind of rewards her behavior as like, well, you would have been right to do this, and like ignore him if he wasn't, like if he was a peasant. You were only bad and you should only be ashamed because, secretly he was worth you all along.
But I would argue that she has probably realized that at some point, because she says reading the letter brought her no joy. So perhaps she has kind of figured out that really, what does it matter?
I figured that reading the letter brought her no joy because she realised what an idiot she'd been and that she'd blown her chances.
Interesting.
I just thought she'd still been ashamed of what she'd done, even though she should have been relieved because, oh, it's okay, he's of my class. I guess because he wasn't so bad. She still felt bad about it.
Yeah, so you see, we've got three people with three different interpretations, and that's what's so good about this story, in my opinion, is that you can see it in lots of different ways. And the more you think about it, the more different ways you can see that it kind of makes sense. And because it makes you go through that process of trying to figure it out and not quite getting there, I think that's what makes it gripping to me, what makes it stay in your head.
I'm
Yes.
still wondering at the end, did she really change? Are they ever going to be together?
I don't think they
Yes.
are going to be together. Or at least I don't think they should be. They don't seem very compatible.
I
They
mean,
have nothing in common.
yeah, and he hates the books that she likes. That seems bad.
And she just doesn't
Oh,
seem like a very nice person.
I don't think she's, yeah, I don't think she is. She's a very bigoted person, maybe.
I like that line near the start. Let me find it. Clever young women of 20 who are handsome besides, who have refused their half dozen offers and are settling down to the conviction that life is a tedious affair. They're not going to care a straw whether a farmhand looks at them or not. There's something funny about that.
It is funny. I think this character is kind of taking the mickey out of people who had this kind of attitude whenever this story was written. I think she's deliberately like over the top in the way she thinks about things.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, exaggeration often makes good characters. We can see the truth in it, which means we can believe that someone like this would exist, but it is still remarkable and therefore worth reading about.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly you don't necessarily want to read about a character who never does anything.
Right.
Like, you want the people who go out and take the wild risks or do the stupid mistakes, because otherwise you don't get a plot.
Okay, I'll talk to you a little bit about Kate. So there are a couple of tidbits about this story from Story of the Week, which is a great website. I'll put it in the episode notes because yeah, it's a really useful source of stories, and it also has some interesting facts on it about the stories that it posts. And there are a couple I thought were worth sharing about this story. So rumor has it that the farmhand in this story, Fred, was named after Kate's youngest son, who did a lot of job hopping, was generally unreliable. She wrote this story when he was 15. He had a very eventful life, did a lot of different jobs. So if the story was intended to be like a warning to him, I don't think it really worked. But then maybe he didn't read it because that seems kind of it seemed kind of in character for him. Also said the website, so I thought that was an interesting little fact about the story. And this story was also rejected by numerous publications before being accepted by the Times Democrat for $5. So this story was worth $5, which doesn't seem right to me at all.
But
think it
this
would have been
was $5 in what, 1890 or something?
equivalent of $150 today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a bit better.
I mean, it is a really good story. Maybe you could have given her a bit more, but I think maybe it was a bit too controversial or too on the nose for some publishers.
Yes, that is why they did not want to publish it, because essentially she was making fun of the kind of class that would read the publications. She did a lot of work like this where she would write about controversial topics and the publishers didn't want them. So things like mixed race relationships, women wanting to sleep with people but not for making babies, stuff like that that would cause a moral panic in the 1890s. I mean, she was one of the first feminist writers because she wrote about these things, but because of that, it was harder for her to get published. She wrote the stories to supplement her income because her husband died and left her with 6 children and $12,000 of debt, which, I mean, it's quite a lot
Yikes.
now. So
If you put that $12,000 in 1890s money or whatever, or current money, I suppose, that's a lot.
it is quite a
That's
lot.
like unimaginable.
Yep. Luckily, she inherited some property from her mother to help her, but she wrote the stories on the side to get some money in because she needed it. The other interesting thing that might have some bearing on this story is that she really hated women of her own class, like society women. She was very disparaging about them, and she would go out of her way to write about, I guess, people from different walks of life because she had so much disdain for the kind of women like Mildred in this story. So yeah, that might change the way you read this one slightly, I suppose. I think I thought about it a bit differently after I read that. That's kind of what turned me on to the idea that maybe it was supposed to be like a mockery or a parody. yeah, that is Kate Chopin in a nutshell.
Nice.
Very interesting. I would like to read more of her stories. This one was very good.
Yeah, I'm
I've read
intrigued.
several. Some of them are very short, and therefore you can just blitz a few of them. But probably don't. Probably just read it and then stir. Let it move around in your head a little bit. Is my advice. Yeah,
Okay.
I liked a lot of the ones that I read.
Have you got any others you'd particularly recommend?
The Kiss, which is one of the shortest short stories I've seen. It's pretty short, but there's a lot of complex emotions packed into it. I thought it was very good.
Okay, I will check it out. The Kiss. All right, unless anyone's got anything else to add, we'll end it there. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, www.shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We're also running a competition at the moment. If you'd like more details, please go to our website and click the link to the competition page. We'd love to read your work, and you have a chance of winning $75 and being featured in the podcast. So send us your stories. Okay, we'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.